In a dark alley where the shadows deepened and the air grew tense, one police officer who thought he had power found out that his bias was not routine. Suddenly, his aggressive words were interrupted by a familiar voice. It was a Black U.S. Army general, confident in his own power and nobility. Like a storm breaking out, their collision led to unpredictable consequences. With each passing moment, fear and tension grew, and it seemed as if the whole world froze in anticipation. We want to know who you are, our viewers. Write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. You are very important to us, and your support helps us promote our channel. Every comment and like makes us stronger, and we appreciate your participation in this important conversation. You really matter. On a sultry summer evening, as the sky began to darken, the streets of the city filled with people seeking to escape the heat. There was tension in the air at this moment, discontent lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed. On one street corner, next to the brightly colored signs, a policeman stood, his gaze scanning the surroundings warily, his expression growing more hostile with each person who passed. At that moment, striding confidently down the sidewalk, the U.S. Army general, a black man with a proud expression, was unaware of the storm that was coming. His uniform gleamed in the evening light, and the medals on his chest reflected his years of service and devotion to his country. He was an example of honesty and strength, but that was precisely what the policeman seemed to hate. "Hey, you!" the policeman suddenly shouted, interrupting the peaceful evening. "Where are you going, black guy?" The general stopped, turned around, his face momentarily contorted in surprise and bewilderment. It wasn't just a question, it was aggression, charged with racism. Rage flared inside him, but he knew he had no right to give in to emotion. He had been raised to understand that his actions must reflect dignity and fortitude. "I'm going home," he answered calmly, trying to maintain his composure. "I don't see any reason for conflict." But the policeman, feeling the power he had, stepped forward, his voice becoming even more sullen. "You must know that not everyone here has the same opinion of you as you have of yourself." The world around them seemed to freeze. Passers-by stopped, their eyes moving from the general to the policeman, and the tension grew. All that was needed was a spark to ignite a fire. The general glanced at the crowd and noticed that many people, some black, some white, were watching with bewilderment and fear. "I serve this country," he said with dignity, trying to draw attention to his uniform. "And as a police officer, you are supposed to protect people, not threaten them." But the policeman had no intention of backing down. Instead, he dropped his disdain, turning to the crowd. "Look at him! Thinks he can mean something here." His voice was angry, and the laughter from the crowd burned the general like a blow. At that moment, the fear that had been rising in the general's chest gave way to determination. He knew that not only was his life at risk, but also the lives of everyone standing nearby. He took a step forward, ready to stand up for his truth, and at that moment, a policeman grabbed him firmly by the sleeve, and the crowd froze, holding its breath. "You will pay for this," the policeman said, his face twisted in hatred, and the general, knowing that his words and actions had consequences, was not about to back down. A volcano of emotion raged inside him, and he felt the power of his experience and service intertwined with the pain that racism had caused him throughout his life. "No," he said, looking the policeman in the eye, "you have no right to threaten me. I am not just your victim. I am a general, and I will not allow you to humiliate me or others." With each word he spoke, the tension in the air became more palpable. Some in the crowd began to shed tears, while others stood with their heads held high, ready to support the general. But the policeman did not seem to realize that he had already crossed the line. "Just try to take a step, and you will know what it means to disobey the law," he said, his hand already clutching the handcuffs. The situation had reached a critical point. Nerves were on edge, and this moment could have turned into anything. Everyone in the crowd understood that the story unfolding before them could become a symbol of struggle, a struggle not only for rights, but also for humanity. How will this conflict develop? What will happen next? The general stood like a rock surrounded by waves of rising hatred, his face calm but his insides seething with emotion. He knew that not only was his life at stake, but the reputation of everything he stood for. The crowd, some black and some white, exchanged worried glances. Some began pulling out their phones, ready to capture what could be a crucial moment of testimony. The policeman, noticing that attention was being directed at him, frowned, his pride and aggression turning into angry contempt. He stepped forward, his handcuffs glinting in the streetlight like an instrument of oppression. "You think your uniform and your medals mean anything?" he growled, approaching. "You're just another black guy trying to stand out." The crowd froze. Everyone understood that this was more than just a conflict between two men. This was a battle for truth, for dignity. The general, feeling the growing tension, took a deep breath and gathered his strength. "You seem to have forgotten that our country was founded on equality," he said, raising his voice so that everyone could hear. "I am not just a man in a uniform. I am a symbol of justice, and you have no right to humiliate me." This was the decisive moment. People began to slowly come closer, expressing support. Some voices were raised, and among them were words of agreement. "We are with you." This gave the general confidence, and the policeman, feeling the pressure, began to panic. "Get out, black man," he shouted again, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The general, not intending to retreat, took a step forward. A flame of determination burned in his eyes, and, remembering his comrades, he said, "I served in battle, defending our country from enemies, and I am not afraid to stand for truth against those who wear the badge." The crowd began to cheer. This spurred the general on. He felt the people's support giving him strength. The policeman, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, reached for his weapon, his hand shaking with anger and fear. "If you don't leave, I will use force," he said, but there was no longer the same confidence in his voice. The general, realizing that not only his freedom but also the fates of others was at stake, decided to take the decisive step. He raised his hands, showing that he was not going to attack, but his eyes did not move from the policeman. "To use force against me is to betray your oath. You cannot intimidate me or anyone else. We are not just victims. We are a society that demands respect and justice." The crowd shouted back, supporting his words. This was the turning point. The policeman, seeing the protest rising, hesitated. His face changed, and shadows of doubt played across it. Inside him, the struggle between his prejudice and the fear of losing control was becoming a real conflict. But then he took a step back, gripping his weapon. "I'm not afraid of you," he growled, though his voice was no longer confident. "Get out, all of you, before I call for backup." "We're not leaving," someone from the crowd shouted, and others joined in. The general turned around, seeing the determination in the eyes of those around him. They weren't going to stand aside. They were ready to fight. "This is our city," the general said, his words echoing down the alley. "We are here to be heard." The crowd, inspired by his courage, began to gather around him, forming a protective circle. With each passing second, the tension grew, and everyone realized that this night could change everything. How will this conflict develop? Will they be able to defend their rights, or will the policeman gain the upper hand? The general, standing in the crowd, felt the energy of the moment growing, but at the same time he was aware of the danger of the situation. The policeman, desperately trying to regain control, continued to shout, his voice becoming even more aggressive and angry. "You blacks think you can just walk in?" he snapped, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You have no place here. This city belongs to people who know what order is." The general, realizing that not only his honor was at stake, but the dignity of all who had been subjected to racism, stepped forward. His voice was full of determination and strength. "We are here because we have a right to be here. You have no right to threaten us simply because we are black." The police gathered nearby began to pile up, drawing attention to the conflict. The general noticed other officers watching the situation with bewilderment, but the policeman standing in front of him was not going to back down. He continued to grip the handcuffs, his face contorted with hatred. "You think your uniform will protect you?" he said, gritting his teeth. "You're just a dark spot on this country. I won't let you sit on the necks of normal people." The policeman's words sent shock waves through the crowd, but many felt they had experienced this before. This hatred, this threat, as if it had been passed down through generations. The general, not wanting to be a victim, felt anger well up inside him. Images of his fellow officers who had also faced similar discrimination came to mind, their faces and stories coming to life in his mind. "We are not your property," he said proudly, raising his head. "We serve this country and protect its values. You are the one who betrays your oath." The policeman, feeling the crowd's support growing, suddenly lunged forward, trying to grab the general's arm. The general, reacting quickly, dodged, and at that moment the crowd screamed, exploding with rage and support. Shouts of "No to racism" echoed through the alley, but the policeman, unwilling to give in, pulled out his taser, his eyes blazing with anger. "You'll get what you deserve," he said, pointing the device at the general. The general's heart began to beat faster. He knew that if he couldn't keep the situation under control now, things could end badly. This was the moment when fear could consume him or, conversely, become a catalyst for action. "We are not afraid of you," someone from the crowd shouted, and this gave the general strength. He understood that his courage could become a spark that would start a whole fire. "If you push the button, I won't be the only one who suffers," the general said, his voice full of confidence. "You won't be able to intimidate us like you did before. This isn't just my fight, it's all of us." At that moment, the policeman, who had lost control, thought for a moment. Doubt flashed in his eyes, but hatred was stronger. He began to press the button, and at that moment the crowd rushed forward, uniting around the general. Their voices merged into a single cry, calling for justice and equality. "Don't let him stop us," someone shouted, and soon the crowd began to advance, pushing the policeman aside. The general, feeling the strength of their unity, stood in their center, ready to repel any attack. The policeman, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, tried to break free, but the general, feeling the support, took a step forward, looking at him confidently. "You can't intimidate us. We won't leave." Suddenly, sirens sounded behind him. Reinforcements were on their way. It was a familiar feeling, fear mixed with hope. The general knew that no matter how things turned out, this night was an important moment. He prepared to fight, knowing that the truth must be defended. This wasn't just one man's battle against the system, it was a challenge to the very essence of racism and oppression, and in that moment, he knew it was up to him to make this night a symbol of change. The sirens were getting closer, piercing the calm of the night, and the noise of the cars, which could be heard in the distance, increased the tension in the air. The general knew that every moment could be decisive. He saw how the policeman, realizing that his actions were gaining support from the crowd, began to panic, losing control. "Get out, or I'll call for help," he shouted, looking at his colleagues who were approaching the scene. There was no longer confidence in his voice, but rather fear and confusion. He understood that the confrontation with the general and the crowd had become a potential source of scandal that could turn against him. The general was not about to back down. He knew this was more than a personal clash. It was a manifestation of the deep-seated racism he had faced throughout his career. Every step he took, every rank he achieved, had to be earned in a world where prejudice and hatred often overshadowed merit. "You think this is just a game?" he said, looking the policeman in the eye. "This isn't just about us. This is about how we all see each other. You represent the hatred that so many of us feel every day, but we won't stay silent." The crowd, feeling the power of his words, began to rise like a wave that was ready to cover everything in its path. People who might have previously stayed on the sidelines began to realize their power. Every word the general said made them feel that they were part of something bigger, that they could make a difference. The policeman, realizing that his aggression was only intensifying the protest, reached for his weapon again. He was ready for the final step to establish his authority. But at that moment, someone from the crowd shouted, "Enough, we will not allow this to happen anymore." The words rang out like an explosion among the people, and the general was overcome by a feeling of unity. He saw how different people unite, how racial boundaries are erased under the influence of a common sense of justice. But the policeman, in desperation, decided that he would act quickly. "If you don't disperse, I will use force," he shouted, his voice shaking with anger and fear. His hand trembled over the stun gun, but before he could press the button, the crowd surged forward, eager to protect the general. "We are here to stand for what is right," someone shouted again, and the cry inspired everyone. People began to rise, each of them realizing that this was their moment to change history. The general, seeing hands raised in determination, felt his own determination grow stronger. But just then, the sound of approaching cars could be heard from behind. It was the police, who had been sent to help. They didn't know what was going on, but their arrival could make the situation worse. The general knew that this could be a tipping point. Once the new officers saw what was happening, it could turn violent. "Don't let them intimidate you," he said, his voice full of confidence. We're here for the truth. More police officers began to emerge from their cars, their gaze darting from the general to the crowd. Some looked puzzled, others looked at the crowd with prejudice, their faces expressing bewilderment and aggression. One of the officers, noticing the tension, shouted, "Disperse, we don't want this to turn into a riot." But instead of dispersing, the crowd united even more, ready to defend its position. The general raised his hand, calling for everyone to remain calm, but his inner voice told him to be prepared for any outcome. "We will not remain silent," the cry rang out again. "We deserve respect and equality." The policeman standing before the general felt his power slipping. He remembered his own experiences of bias, of his colleagues turning a blind eye to their own mistakes. It became clear to him that he had become part of a system that created hatred and division, and now it was separating him from his humanity. The situation was heating up, and everyone in the crowd realized that their actions could change everything. The general, feeling supported, said, "We are here to put an end to this hatred. Let us be the ones who change this history." As more police closed in and tensions mounted, the general faced a pivotal decision: maintain peace and justice, or confront the violence and racism that had claimed too many lives. But he knew that now, more than ever, every voice mattered. The situation had reached a critical point. The general, facing an aggressive police officer and surrounded by a crowd, knew that not only his rights were at stake, but the rights of everyone who had encountered racism. Emotions were running high, and every new sound, every moving shadow seemed like a potential threat. The policeman, feeling the support of his colleagues, tried to regain control of the situation. "I'm warning you," he shouted again, his voice tense. "Move away, or I'll use force." The crowd, not intending to give in, began to fill with anger. The general raised his hands, calling for calm, but he himself also felt his heart beating in unison with the loud cries of the people. At this moment, different voices were heard in the crowd, each of which expressed their opinion on what was happening. "We are not here to run away," said one of the young men standing next to the general. "We are here to defend our rights." The policeman, seeing the situation getting out of control, stepped forward and reached for the stun gun again. The general, noticing this, stepped forward, trying to make eye contact to stop him. "You have no right to threaten me or anyone else," he said, his voice confident despite the growing tension. "You represent the hatred we all fight. You're not the only one in uniform. We serve, too." At that moment, the tension in the air became palpable, like a taut string about to snap. The policeman, trying to reassert his authority, said with disdain, "You all just want to press a sore spot. You are the problem, not the solution." The crowd erupted in shouts. The general felt the people around him becoming one. Everyone knew that this was not just a battle for him, but for the right to be heard and respected. "We will not remain silent any longer," someone shouted, and this became a signal for the others. The situation was becoming tense and there was a sense of danger in the air. The general knew that if the police officer decided to use force, it could lead to violence and consequences that no one could predict. The policeman, still holding his taser at the ready, suddenly froze, feeling the pressure of the crowd. He noticed his colleagues starting to look at each other, and their eyes were filled with worry. Some of them were already beginning to realize that supporting the general, rather than suppressing the people, was the right way to go. The general, deciding it was time to act, said, "If you use force against us, you will not only betray your oaths, you will undermine the trust that must exist between the police and the public." The general's words, full of passion and conviction, made the crowd freeze. They were ready to support him, but at that moment a policeman, overheated with hatred and fear, suddenly rushed at the general, trying to grab him. The crowd screamed in horror. The general, expecting this, dodged and, with a movement of his hand, pushed the policeman away, who lost his balance and fell to the ground. This was the turning point. The crowd, seeing this, cried out with relief and anger at the same time. "Don't touch him," they shouted. "We're here to protect him." The policeman, rising to his feet, felt the pressure from the crowd again. His colleagues were beginning to realize that such an attack could lead to violence and consequences they did not want to see. The situation was heating up, and the general had a feeling that they might reach a tipping point. "I will not remain silent any longer," he said, looking at the policeman defiantly. "We will not give in to fear. We will fight for our right to be here, for our right to be human." The policeman, feeling all eyes on him, found himself trapped. His hatred collided with the reality that he was on the verge of losing control, and any move he made could be the beginning of violence that would turn against him. The sound of more cars could be heard quietly, more police reinforcements. The general knew that time was running out and every moment mattered. This could be a historic night, and he was not about to give up. "We are here to defend the truth," he shouted, raising his hand, "and this is only the beginning." And in that moment, he felt a powerful current of unity sweep through everyone around him. The general knew they could make a difference. This was their opportunity to be a voice for change and justice. The policeman, realizing that control was slipping away from him, clutched the stun gun again, his face contorted with anger and fear. He took a step forward, as if to show once and for all who was boss. The general, realizing that the tension could no longer be contained, raised his hands in an attempt to calm the crowd. "We are not your enemies," he said, his voice sounding confident, but there was already a growing tension in it. "We are here to defend our rights." The policeman, who had already lost all patience, sharply pointed the stun gun at the general. His colleagues, watching what was happening, began to exchange nervous glances, realizing that the situation was getting out of control. "Get out of here, all of you, or I'll arrest you all," he shouted, but his words sounded more like a threat than a command. The crowd responded with indignation, their anger flaring up like a fire. People began to move forward, approaching the general, as if each of them felt obliged to protect him. "We will not let you intimidate us," someone shouted, and the crowd began to echo the cry, creating a powerful chorus of voices that filled the street. At this point, the new police officers who had just arrived began to get out of their cars, ready to intervene. They assessed the situation and saw that the crowd was ready to resist. The general knew that he had to act quickly. If a police officer decided to use force, it could have dire consequences for everyone. "I'm not afraid of you," the general shouted, raising his voice so that everyone could hear. "You have no right to threaten me or anyone else." The policeman, feeling his power threatened, tried to take a step back, but fear and hatred had already clouded his judgment. He looked at his partner, who only shook his head, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, one member of the crowd, desperate to help the general, held up a banner with a slogan that read, "We are all equal." This caused another surge of emotion, and others began to raise their banners, shouting, "Justice." The general, seeing this unity, felt his spirit fill with hope. "We are here to fight for our place in this society," he said, feeling the tension rising. "We will not remain silent any longer." The crowd shouted back, and this led to another wave of support. But the policeman, who had lost all control, suddenly rushed forward, trying to grab the general. People around them began to move, raising their hands to protect him. It was like a spring being compressed, the tension reaching its peak. "Stop!" one of the new policemen shouted, trying to intervene, but his words were lost in the chaos. The policeman, blinded by hatred, tried to push the general, but he dodged, and at that moment the policeman stumbled, losing his balance. The general, seeing that his moment had come, ran closer to the crowd and shouted, "We can do it. We are stronger than they think." At this point several people from the crowd stepped forward, trying to surround the general, and the policeman, rising to his feet, became furious again. "Get away from him," he shouted, his voice sounding hysterical. The crowd burst into an even more powerful cry, "We're not leaving, we're protecting him." Feeling the pressure, the policeman pulled out his taser again and pointed it at the general, but at that moment one of his colleagues, finally deciding to intervene, stepped forward. "Enough," he said, looking at the policeman with disapproval. "We can't treat people like this." But the policeman, having lost control of the situation, shouted, "You don't understand, they are a threat." The crowd began to roar in response, and it became clear to the general that not only was his life at stake, but so were the lives of many people who had come to support him. He felt his blood boil with anger. "You are a threat," he said, looking the policeman straight in the eye. "You have become part of the system that is destroying our lives." At this point, a new wave of police forces began to advance towards the crowd, and the situation became extremely tense. Everyone knew that this could end badly, but no one was going to back down. The general gathered all his energy and, addressing the crowd, shouted, "We are here to show that racism will not pass. This is our moment, and we must not miss it." The crowd erupted in cheers once again, ready to fight for what was right, and at this point there was no doubt that the conflict was only just beginning to escalate. Everyone understood that not only their future was at stake, but the future of their communities. The policeman, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, began to move closer to the general, and his confidence was rapidly waning. The crowd's gaze became more and more aggressive, and each shout raised the tension level to the limit. "Get away from him," the policeman shouted, his voice shaking with rage and fear. He pointed the taser at the general, but at that moment the crowd stepped forward as a single unit. Each man was ready to stand up for his leader, and it gave them strength. "We will not retreat," someone from the crowd shouted. "We are here to protect our general and ourselves." Others began to take up the shouts, and soon the street was filled with slogans about justice and equality. The police officers who had arrived to reinforce the situation began to realize that the situation could escalate into a real conflict. They looked at each other, unsure how to react to what was unfolding before them. The general, feeling supported, took a step forward. "You cannot intimidate us," he said, his voice sounding confident. "Our strength is in unity, and we will not let this hatred break us." At that moment, the policeman, losing his composure, swung the stun gun again. His colleagues began to get nervous, and one of them shouted, "Stop, don't!" But this cry could no longer stop the passions from escalating. The policeman, clutching a stun gun, rushed at the general, and at that moment the crowd rushed forward again, ready to protect their leader. "Don't touch him," someone shouted, and others began pushing, trying to create a barrier between the general and the aggressive policeman. The policeman, seeing the crowd becoming increasingly unruly, took a step back in panic, but then, realizing that his actions could have serious consequences, he rushed at the general again, not noticing that his colleagues were already beginning to intervene. "Get him out," one of the new policemen shouted, trying to stop the conflict, but it was too late. The situation was escalating, and both sides were on the verge of violence. Suddenly, there was a sound that tore through the air, a shot. Somewhere in the distance, everyone froze, and the tension instantly reached its limit. Some in the crowd felt a sense of fear, but others, on the contrary, flared up with determination. "This is not normal," one of the activists shouted, raising his fist. "We will not remain silent when we are intimidated." The general, feeling a surge of energy from the man's words, knew they had to act. "Don't let this fear control you. We won't let this hatred divide us." The crowd, seeing the policeman trying to advance again, shouted in unison, "Justice, equality, we will not retreat." At this point, a sense of tension hung in the air, as if everyone knew that one wrong move could lead to large-scale violence. The general, gathering all his will, stepped forward again. "We are here to fight for our rights, and if you use force, you will only prove that we are right." The policeman, who did not know how to react to such audacity, suddenly rushed forward, and the crowd responded with a powerful cry, "Don't let him stop us." All this time, new police officers began to rise to the general, but instead of supporting their colleague, many of them began to realize that this was not just a conflict, but a demonstration against systemic injustice. One of the policemen, unhappy with what was happening, shouted, "Enough, get out of here or we will use force." But the crowd, not giving in, began to advance. The general felt his heart fill with determination. "We are here to change that," he shouted, raising his fist. "We are the voice of those who have been silenced." The policeman, losing control, pulled out his taser again and pointed it at the general, but this only provoked further anger from the crowd. "You can't treat us like this," someone from the crowd shouted, preparing to defend their leader. At that moment, the sirens sounded again, but this time they were close. They were new reinforcements, and their arrival only heightened the tension. Everyone felt that this would be a decisive moment. Someone had to take a step back or risk everything. The general realized that the time had come. They had to demonstrate their strength of unity, even if it meant clashing. "We will not leave. We stand for the truth," he shouted, raising his hands to support his men. The crowd, as one, raised their hands, and it was like a wave rising to the sky. They knew that they were not just speaking out for themselves, but for all who had suffered injustice. The policeman, seeing this power, suddenly froze. The hatred that filled him began to give way to doubt. He could not believe that his actions could lead to violence, and in turn, cause all of them to stoop to this level. The general felt that the moment had come. Now everything depended on their decision. They could change the situation, but only if they remained united. The situation had reached a critical point, and the tension was almost palpable. The general, standing in front of the policeman, knew that they were on the brink of a real conflict. The crowd's eyes were full of determination and fear, and every step could turn into a catastrophe. "We will not retreat," someone from the crowd shouted, and these words, full of determination, awakened feelings of anger and hope in everyone. The general, looking at the faces of the people around him, realized that this was not just his battle, but a battle for the rights of each of them. The policeman, holding his taser at the ready, looked increasingly frightened. He felt the pressure from his colleagues and the crowd growing. Some of his comrades were beginning to doubt their actions, but he could not stop. There were voices in his head demanding that order be maintained at any cost. "You are all a threat," he shouted, looking at the general as if trying to find weakness in his eyes. "I will not allow you to undermine our work." But the general, realizing that this was not just a fight for himself, but also for history, said, "You represent the hatred that we can no longer tolerate. Each of U.S. deserves respect, regardless of skin color or rank." And then something unexpected happened. A man who had once been a policeman stepped out of the crowd. He shook his head and said, "I've worked with you, and I know that's not what we wear this uniform for. We're supposed to protect people, not intimidate them." The words hung in the air like a heavy veil. The policeman, blinded by hatred, turned to his colleague with bewilderment. His eyes showed alarm. This situation was not just a battle between two sides, it was a clash of values. "You're betraying your own," he said, panic in his voice. "We must control them." But the crowd, as if encouraging one another, became even more active. Every voice was a challenge. They knew that there was more at stake than their individual lives. This was about the future, about justice and equality. The general, feeling the support, raised his voice. "We are here to show that fear will not stop us. We will fight to the end, because behind us are those who could not come out here on their own." Suddenly there was a cracking sound and everyone froze. It was the sound of a gunshot. It came from the crowd and everyone turned around in horror. The seconds slowed down as someone fell to the ground. Screams and panic filled the street. The general, seeing that one of the protesters was wounded, sprang to his feet. "No!" he cried, and his voice sounded like thunder amidst lightning. He rushed toward the fallen man, his heart beating in unison with the terror of the crowd. The crowd erupted in cries of anger and pain, their emotions flaring up with renewed vigor. "What have you done?" someone shouted. "This is all because of you." The policeman, afraid of the consequences, rushed back. He realized that his actions had caused a tragedy, and it was reflected in the faces of his colleagues. They began to understand that this moment was more than just a collision. It was a battle for life and death. "Stop this!" one of the new cops shouted, realizing that violence would only make the situation worse. "This is not what we were fighting for." But the crowd's pressure grew even stronger. They could not accept that one of their own had fallen victim. A loud sound of screams and sobs filled the air, and everyone felt the weight of the moment. The general, bending over the wounded man, felt his heart breaking. He saw the life draining from the man's eyes, and he knew it was the result of the hatred and prejudice they had all fought against. "We can't let this be in vain," he said, feeling tears welling up in his eyes. "We have to continue despite this." As if rising from the depths, the crowd's voice resounded again. They began to shout the wounded man's name, their unity becoming a symbol of the struggle. It was a moment no one would ever forget. The general, despite his sadness, stood up and turned to the police, his voice like thunder. "You can continue to intimidate us, but we will not remain silent. We will stand for the truth, even if it means sacrifice." The crowd, filled with determination, raised their voices once more, and this unity became a mantra against hatred. Everyone knew that there was no room for fear in this battle, only hope and the desire for justice. And when that night seemed darker than ever before, it also became a symbol of the light they could create together, despite all the tragedies they had to endure. The police officer standing before the general felt his mind fill with rage and fear. His actions masked years of bias and systemic racism embedded in his mind. He had grown up in an environment where hatred and fear of people of other races were the norm. Every day of his work reinforced his belief that he was protecting order, safety, while ignoring what order actually meant to the people he was charged with protecting. The general, with his impressive status and charisma, became for him the embodiment of everything he hated. A black officer in uniform, who had gone through the army's trials and earned respect, seemed a threat to the policeman. In his eyes, generals were a symbol of a system that, in his opinion, had betrayed his own people, and it was like a knife in the heart. When the general raised his voice, demanding respect and justice, the policeman saw it as a challenge. The moment the crowd began to shout in support of the general, his own hatred flared up. He felt that he was losing control of the situation. Memories of his own past flashed through the cop's mind, of how he had been taught that people of color needed to be controlled. He saw his colleagues wavering, how they began to realize that this was not just a protest, but a movement for justice. It terrified him, and he became even more aggressive in order to reassert his power and authority. At this point, when the general addressed the crowd, he saw that the policeman was losing his patience. Emotions were seething inside him, and this only strengthened his prejudice. He saw how people in the crowd supported the general, and in his eyes this was perceived as an attempt to rebel against order. His own fear led him to the idea that he needed to act immediately to suppress this rebellion. That's why he threw himself at the general, challenging everything he represented. For the policeman, this was not just a conflict, it was a fight for his own perception of the world. When the policeman pulled the trigger on his taser, he thought he would regain control and show everyone who was boss, but his actions only provoked the crowd into even greater protest. As the general dodged the blow, he realized that this policeman was not just protecting order, he represented all the evil they were fighting against. The crowd, seeing the policeman attacking their leader, filled the streets with cries of anger. "We will not allow this," they shouted, their voices becoming a powerful chorus, reflecting the hatred and despair that was hidden in their hearts. The general, realizing that his strength lay in unity, shouted, "We must remember why we are here. This is not just a fight against this man, this is a fight against the system that allows this to happen." And in that moment, with the sense of tragedy and hatred in the air, the general realized that his mission went beyond his own experiences. It was about giving a voice to those who had never had the opportunity to be heard. He knew that despite the fear, they had to stand together, or else hatred and prejudice would continue to kill their future. As if calling for action, he raised his fist again. "We will not be silent. This is our moment to change the system, and we cannot let fear win." And the crowd, encouraged by his words, once again shouted in support. This night had become a symbol of their struggle, and they knew that they were united not only by their hatred of the policeman, but also by their desire for justice, which must be achieved at any cost. When people saw a white police officer humiliating a black army general, many were shocked and upset. Some began to shout and protest, trying to draw attention to the injustice of what was happening. The crowd gathered, growing in number, and many began to rise to their feet in solidarity with the general. People began to raise placards with slogans about equality and justice, their voices merging into a powerful chorus demanding an end to the aggression. Some rushed forward to protect the general, shouting for the policeman to stop. Others, knowing that violence could escalate the situation, tried to remain calm, calling for dialogue and respect. Everyone in the crowd understood that this moment was not just an accident, but the embodiment of a systemic injustice that must be condemned. The different reactions underscored the complexity of the situation. Some were embarrassed, unsure of how to react, while others began to gather their phones to record what was happening, hoping that this would help draw attention to the problem. It became a moment of unification, when everyone realized the importance of fighting for justice, and the people's determination grew stronger with each new cry. The crowd, overcome with emotion, became increasingly aggressive. When the policeman pushed the general again, a sense of tragedy hung in the air. Every cry from the people became more desperate, and the feeling that they were on the brink of disaster grew. "Don't you dare touch him," someone from the crowd shouted, and this only fueled the anger of others. The general, feeling supported, raised his head, but in his heart there was growing anxiety. He knew that his presence could lead to violence, and every action of the policeman could end in tragedy. And then disaster struck. At one point, as the policeman was trying to grab the general again, one of the protesters, excited by what was happening, rushed forward to intervene. In the confusion, he accidentally collided with another policeman, who, not realizing what was happening, fired. Time slowed down and the crack of a gunshot pierced the air. People froze in horror. The general, realizing that one of the protesters had been hit, rushed towards him. Screams of pain and panic echoed through the crowd. It was the moment when fear became reality. The protester fell to the ground, gasping for breath. The general leaned over him and saw the life drain from his eyes. "No, no, no," he repeated, feeling his heart breaking with grief. This tragedy had become a symbol of what they were trying to stop: violence, indifference, and hatred. The crowd, overcome with shock, began to panic. The screams turned into cries and people began to scatter. Some tried to help the wounded man, while others ran to the sides, afraid that the situation could turn into an even greater tragedy. At this point, many realized that their fight for justice could cost them their lives. The police, realizing they had crossed the line, began to try to control the situation, but now it looked like a flame, igniting even more anger. The general, still kneeling before the wounded man, realized that this was not just his battle. This was a war for souls, for lives that could be destroyed in an instant. "We can't let this happen," he shouted, rising to his feet, but his words were already lost in the chaos and tragedy. He knew they were all connected now by this blood, this suffering. The people, seeing one of them hurt, began to rise again, their voices sounding like a cry of pain, turning into a powerful slogan against hatred and violence. "We will not give up," they shouted, but even these words sounded half lost against the backdrop of the tragedy that had just happened. Everyone knew they were standing on the edge where hatred could consume them all. The general, looking at the wounded man, realized that his mission now took on an even greater meaning. This was not just a fight for rights, it was about saving lives. But when the police began to act, the crowd heated up again. They refused to leave, even when their own lives were at stake. This was the turning point, and everyone in the crowd knew that they were not just fighting for themselves, but for all those who could not come out and claim their rights. It was a grim reminder that hatred and prejudice could lead to tragic consequences at any moment. The general felt his heart fill with determination. He knew that this night would not end until they saw change, even if it cost them a lot. The crowd, overcome with grief and anger, felt their unity becoming increasingly fragile. As the screams and cries began to mix with the sirens of approaching police cars, the tension rose to a breaking point. Everyone knew that the situation could escalate into something terrible. The general, still standing over the wounded man, felt his own strength failing. He saw the men around him disintegrating in despair, and he knew they had to remain united. "We cannot let this moment be our defeat," he shouted, but his words were lost in the growing chaos. Suddenly, as if in response to his call, a voice came from the crowd: "We must go. They won't stop until they start shooting." Some began to retreat, their faces filled with fear, but others, consumed with rage, decided that they would not leave until they had justice. This created a rift in the crowd. Those who wanted to avoid violence began to leave, but those who remained began to rise and shout. "We are here to fight," they shouted, and it was a challenge that reminded them of what they were fighting for. But at that moment, the police, having received orders to disperse the crowd, began to act. Sirens began to blare, and soon the crowd was surrounded by police with batons and shields. The general, seeing the violence coming, felt his heart tighten with fear. He knew that every second mattered now, and that they could lose everything. "Step back," shouted a policeman with a megaphone. "Get rid of them, this is your last chance." Some protesters began to panic, which only made matters worse. Suddenly, a sound like a gunshot was heard. It was a shot in the air, and it was the signal for chaos to begin. People began to run, but in the confusion, many got lost. The general, feeling that he had to do something, raised his hand, trying to call everyone to calm. "Stop, don't let them intimidate you. We can't surrender now." But his words were a whisper amid the general shouting and panic. The protesters, filled with fear and rage, began throwing objects at the police. This was the spark that ignited the violence. The police responded with tear gas, and the air filled with a choking cloud that began to spread through the crowd. People began to cough, their faces distorted with pain. Panic seized the crowd, and it, like a living organism, began to move in different directions, all trying to find a way out. The general, realizing that this night could end in disaster, shouted again, "We cannot allow hatred to win." But his words were lost in the sounds of chaos. Many in the crowd began to wonder if this was all they could do. At that moment, one protester, overcome with anger, threw a rock at a police officer. This act became a trigger, and the police began to use force, dispersing the crowd. "Run!" someone shouted, and that was the signal for more chaos. People began to stumble over each other, desperately trying to escape the trap created by fear and violence. The general, realizing that everything could end in tragedy, gathered all his strength for the last time. "We must show them that we are not just a crowd, we are a people fighting for our lives." But even his words couldn't stop the spiral of violence that was beginning to swirl around them. Everyone knew they were on the brink, and all they had to do was not let hatred and fear take over. At this point, one of the women in the crowd, seeing what was happening, cried out, "Save yourselves, we cannot be victims of their hatred." And this caused a new wave of emotions. People began to realize that their struggle should not lead to more violence, but fear and anger were stronger. The sounds of struggle were heard around them, and every second could be decisive. The general, facing the danger, felt his own resolve begin to weaken. He knew that everything they were fighting for could be lost if they did not find a way to unite against this chaos. But at that moment, something terrible happened. Another shot rang out among the police, and this was the beginning of a new wave of fear. People panicked and ran in different directions, and this moment changed the course of events forever. The general, watching his comrades leave, knew that this tragedy was not just part of their struggle, but a sad symbol of what was happening in society. He knew that despite everything that had happened, they had to continue to fight. It was not only for their lives, but for the lives of those who would not yet be able to speak. The situation had reached a critical point, and the chaos that had engulfed the crowd had become uncontrollable. The policeman who had first attacked the general stood in the center of this turbulent ocean of anger and fear. His heart was pounding with adrenaline, and thoughts were forming in his head that were trying to break out, but they could not overshadow his confusion. When he saw one of his colleagues open fire, his fear turned to panic. The policeman instinctively took a step back, realizing that the situation was out of control. He looked at the general, who now stood there, determined but with concern in his eyes, and saw in him not an enemy, but a man who also fought for his ideals. The crowd, heated with emotion, began to react to the gunfire. The protesters, realizing that the violence was not stopping, became even more aggressive. The policeman felt fear creeping up on him. He did not want to be part of this madness, but he did not know how to get out of the situation he found himself in. At this point, his own colleagues began to lose control. Seeing one of the protesters throw a rock in panic, the police officer stepped forward to intervene, only to be confronted by another officer who was ready to use force. The whole situation seemed chaotic and hopeless. When the crowd began throwing objects at the police, he suddenly realized that this wasn't just a protest against the system, it was a cry for help. He realized that the hatred he was generating was only making the suffering worse. A contradiction arose within him. He couldn't allow himself to be part of the violence. However, as the crowd began to close in, the policeman suddenly felt his colleagues becoming more aggressive. One of them, wiping sweat from his face, shouted, "Hold on, they're attacking us." The panicking protesters, trying to escape the encirclement, began to run in different directions. The policeman, realizing that he himself was becoming part of this suppression machine, suddenly felt his heart squeeze with shame. He remembered that he had once sworn to protect people, not to harm them. Unable to bear it any longer, he retreated, trying not to get involved in the clashes. His eyes met the general's, and in that moment he saw him not as an enemy, but as a man who had also been harmed. The general, standing at the front, expressed not just anger, but the suffering he had witnessed. Then the policeman stepped forward. He raised his hands to show that he was not going to attack. "Stop!" he shouted, addressing both his colleagues and the protesters. "We must not continue this violence." His voice was full of fear, but also determination. He hoped that at least someone would hear him. Some of the policemen were uneasy and began to hesitate. The protesters, seeing his actions, froze for a moment, their anger gradually giving way to bewilderment. The policeman, realizing that this was his only chance, continued, "This is not what we should do. We are all people, and we should unite, not divide." But the fear and prejudice were too strong. His colleagues, seeing his inappropriate behavior, began to approach him, biting their lips in rage. One of them said, "Are you crazy? They are not people." But at that moment something unexpected happened. The general, noticing the change in the policeman's behavior, shouted, "If anyone wants to stop this madness, Let's talk to each other. The policeman felt hope come over him. He knew that this could be the beginning of change, but there was still fear in his soul. He knew that he and his colleagues would have to accept the reality that surrounded them. However, there was a shift in the crowd. People began to realize that their struggle did not have to lead to violence. They stood still, looking at the general and the policeman, who both advocated peace despite their differences. The situation remained tense, but a dialogue began. The policeman, this time with an open heart, approached the general and, lowering his voice, said, "I want this to stop. I don't want to be part of the violence." The general, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, nodded. "If we all talk and listen to each other, we can change this." This moment was a turning point, and although fear was still in the air, for the first time that night there was a glimmer of hope. The policeman and the general stood face to face, their eyes locked, and a sense of possibility hung in the air. The general, realizing the importance of the moment, raised his voice again, addressing the crowd. "We are not here to fight each other. We are here to fight for justice and equality. This is our common fight." Some of the protesters began to slowly approach, their faces showing mixed emotions from disbelief to hope. They watched as the policeman, still with his hands raised, continued, "I realize that I am part of a system that sometimes causes pain, but I want to be part of change. I don't want this evening to end in violence." Despite the fear, quiet conversations began to emerge from the crowd. People, gradually realizing that even among the police there were those who were ready to listen to them, began to come closer. But the situation was still tense. The other police officers, not understanding what was happening, began to look at each other, and several of them were about to use force. One of them, a sergeant, shouted, "What are you doing, idiot? You're letting us down." The general, feeling the growing tension, took the floor again. "Let's stop this now before it's too late. We can find a way to talk and understand each other." And then something unexpected happened. One of the protesters, realizing that someone from the police really wanted to help, came closer. He was a young guy, full of hope. He said, "We are all people. We all want to live in peace. Let's talk, not fight." Some of the crowd, seeing the boy take a step forward, began to support him. Gradually others began to come forward, wanting to hear and be heard. The policeman, realizing that dialogue had become possible, tried to establish contact with his colleagues. "Listen," he said to his comrades, "we can't go on like this. This is not what we want. We need to be here to protect people, not threaten them." But one of the policemen, still overcome with anger, shouted, "All they do is shout at us. They don't want to hear us." The general, realizing that the situation could again escalate into violence, took the initiative. "I hear you. I'm ready to talk to you," he said, addressing the police officers. "But for that, we all need to calm down and understand that we have to work together." As if by magic, the tension in the air gradually began to subside. The policeman who had spoken out against violence saw some of his colleagues begin to listen. Even in their hearts, uncertainty crept in. Could they really make a difference? At this point the general addressed the crowd. "We must use this opportunity. We are here to talk, not to fight. It is our common responsibility to find a solution together." The crowd, realizing that their voice could be heard, slowly began to calm down. Instead of cries of hatred and fear, voices began to be heard, full of hope and a desire to change the situation. This was the beginning of a new dialogue. Protesters and police officers began to exchange opinions, stories about their experiences, what they felt, and what they wanted. Clashes and hatred began to give way to understanding and dialogue. The policeman, standing next to the general, felt his heart fill with hope. He realized that this could be the beginning of the change they had all been waiting for. Together, they began to build bridges where there had been walls, and this became a new step in their common fight for justice. The general, standing in the crowd, felt hope ignite in his heart. He knew that this moment could be a turning point not only for him, but for everyone present. Despite the physical and emotional strain, he sought to use this opportunity to end the violence and restore trust. As the crowd began to slow down and the shouts gave way to voices filled with a desire to understand and be understood, the general felt a sense of unity rise up within him. He saw in the faces of the protesters not just anger and fear, but a hunger for change that they all shared. The conversation that began in that moment became a slow but important process. The general, realizing that his role was no longer just to advocate but to facilitate dialogue, began to share his story. He talked about how his own experiences in the military had shaped his outlook on life, how he had faced bias, and how important it was to him that everyone have a voice. His words resonated with many. Some of the policemen who had previously stood aside began to listen with greater attention. The general continued, "I served my country and I saw how beautiful it can be, but I also saw how unfair it can be. We all want the same thing, peace and security for our families. Let's make that a reality for all of us." Gradually, the atmosphere changed. Protesters began to share their experiences, talking about their fears and hopes. Some spoke about how their lives and the lives of their loved ones had been affected by bias and violence. The general knew this was an important moment for everyone. He began working with some of the protesters and police officers to create a small group that could continue the dialogue and find ways to reconcile. Meanwhile, the policeman who had spoken out against violence became one of those who began to support the general. He realized that they had a common goal, and together they could begin the process of change. The general looked at him and sensed that they were moving in the right direction. He knew it would be a difficult path, but he knew they had taken the first step. Together, they began working to create a platform for dialogue where people could share stories and find common solutions. That night, when the city was silent again, the general stood there, thinking about what had happened. He felt the weight he carried on his shoulders lighten a little. He knew that the fight for justice and equality was ongoing, and that every step toward peace was important. His heart filled with hope as he saw people who had once been enemies now become allies. He knew that this night would not only be a momentous one for him, but for many others who were seeking change. The general, realizing that his role was now to facilitate and support, decided to continue his mission to make the world around him a better place. He knew the road would be long, but he was ready to move forward, taking steps every day toward the peace they all deserved. As the tension in the crowd gradually died down, the general remained where he was, his mind in turmoil. He watched as protesters and police officers began to interact, sharing their stories and aspirations, but a shadow of bitterness and weariness grew in his heart. The general knew that while this moment was a symbol of hope, it left deep wounds that would not heal instantly. He remembered how his own dreams of justice and equality had fallen prey to hatred and prejudice. Every encounter with the police, every humiliation he had experienced in his life, came alive in his mind. The difficulty of the situation was not only that he was facing prejudice on a personal level, but also that he was a general, a man expected to be courageous and strong, but that night he felt vulnerable, and it was hard. The moral burden he carried became all the more difficult when he realized that even those who were close to him did not always understand his suffering. He wandered the empty streets, thinking about what had happened. Despite his words of hope and change, an inner conflict raged within him. The general felt that his responsibility was not only to defend his country, but to be a voice for those who had no voice. With each thought, he felt the weight of his heart tighten as he realized that change would take time and sacrifice. The general remembered how many of his fellow soldiers had also faced prejudice, but not all of them could speak openly about it. He realized that he carried not only his own history on his shoulders, but also the stories of those who had long ago given up. Every step down the street brought him a new realization. Change wouldn't happen just because of one night, one conversation. He knew there would be a lot of struggle ahead, and sometimes it would be painful, but there was hope in that realization, too, an understanding that even small steps could lead to something bigger. All the while, he thought about the wounded protester, how he had been in the right place at the right time. The general felt that this wasn't just a fluke, it was a reminder that they all, no matter the color of their skin, faced the same reality. He knew his job now was to help others recognize that and work for change, even if it wasn't easy. When the general returned home, he looked in the mirror and saw the reflection of a man who was supposed to be a leader, but who still felt the darkness of hatred surrounding him. He knew he had to accept his vulnerability in order to move forward. Only by acknowledging his fears and worries could he become a true leader to those who needed support. This realization didn't bring him immediate relief, but it did give him hope that he wasn't alone in his struggle. The general decided that his journey would be not only personal, but also public. He would work with others to create a space for dialogue where people could speak openly about their experiences and what they wanted the future to look like. So, standing before his reflection, the general vowed not to give up. Even when the moral weight became insurmountable, he knew that his story was just one of many, and he was ready to continue his fight to change the world around him. After that tense night, the general decided that his fight against racism should not be just a personal matter, but a social movement. He understood that change takes time, patience, and collaboration, and he began actively working to create a platform where people could share their stories and find ways to reconcile. He first contacted local activists who were already familiar with issues of racism and bias. Together, they began organizing meetings where residents could openly discuss their experiences and fears. The general shared his experiences and emphasized the importance of unity in the fight against hate. With each meeting, the number of participants grew. People of all races and ages came to share their opinions and stories. The general became a symbol of change, his presence inspiring others. He noticed that many who had previously been hesitant to speak up began to open up, sharing their own experiences with bias. But there were challenges along the way. The general faced resistance from both some police officers and local groups who did not want change. They felt they were happy with the current system and saw no need to discuss racism. Some protesters, angered again, also began to express frustration that their voices were not being heard. The general understood that to succeed, it was necessary not only to speak of love and understanding, but also to acknowledge the pain that had been caused. He organized roundtables where participants could voice their grievances and complaints without fear of reprisals. The general himself sat at the table, listening and maintaining an open dialogue. This created an atmosphere of trust where people began to realize that their voices mattered. Over time, concrete steps toward change began. The general worked with local authorities to implement educational programs aimed at raising awareness of racism and bias in schools and public institutions. He also began working on a project to create a multifunctional center where people could receive information about their rights and opportunities. However, the struggle was not always easy. The general often faced criticism and doubt from some activists who believed that he was too cautious and did not take risks. They called for more radical actions and protests. The general understood their point of view, but also knew that the only way to achieve change was through dialogue and understanding, not violence. As time went on, although the steps towards change were small, they began to bear fruit. Local residents began to feel more confident in expressing their thoughts and experiences. Educational programs that were introduced into schools began to show results. Young people began to understand the importance of respect and understanding of differences. One of the most significant moments was the opening of a multifunctional center, which became a meeting place for everyone. The general organized various events, lectures and workshops there, where people could learn, discuss and work together. Each event was filled with emotion and hope. The general felt his efforts were beginning to bear fruit, and this inspired him to continue. He knew the road ahead would be long and arduous, but each step, each interview, and each interaction brought them closer to their shared goal of creating a society free of racism and bias. Still, there remained a moral heaviness within him, the knowledge that some people would never understand or accept change. The general understood that despite progress, truly defeating racism would require deep analysis and understanding not just from those who suffer from bias, but from those who perpetuate it. However, his hope did not fade. He continued to work, inspiring others to fight for justice and equality. This fight became not only his personal cause, but also the common cause of all who dreamed of a world free of hatred. The general continued his work, and over time, his efforts began to bear fruit. The multi-purpose center became a place where people gathered to discuss racism, share experiences, and find solutions. Educational programs helped young people understand the importance of respect and diversity. With each new event, trust in the community grew. People became more open to each other, and a desire to work together arose in their hearts. The general, observing this process, felt his own wounds begin to heal. He understood that even small steps can lead to big changes. But with success came challenges. The general knew that some people still resisted change, and that worried him, but he didn't let that stop him. He continued to advocate for dialogue and understanding, believing that this was the only way to achieve real change. One day, a meeting was held at the center, attended by both activists and police officers. The general opened the discussion by inviting everyone to express their thoughts and feelings. He was full of hope, but also anxiety. Could this dialogue really lead to something meaningful? As the conversation began, many expressed their fears and expectations. Gradually, the atmosphere became more and more open. The general felt that these sincere discussions could become the bridge that would connect the different sides. At the end of the meeting, as the participants began to disperse, he felt a surge of energy and hope. He knew that their fight would not end, but this moment was an important step toward a future where prejudice and hatred would give way to understanding and unity. From then on, the general continued his work, knowing that change was a process that took time and effort, but he also knew that they were on the right track, and together they could create a society where everyone felt safe and respected. Every day he became more and more confident that the fight for justice was not just his personal mission, but a common cause of the entire community, and everyone who came to the center became part of this important work. Thus, the story of the general who, overcoming his inner demons and external challenges, became a symbol of change, ended on a note of hope. He continued his journey, inspiring people to dialogue and join action, and although the fight against racism was long, he knew that together they could create a more just and equal society. With every step they took, with every word they spoke during their discussions, the general understood that change was possible, and even in the most difficult times, when everything seemed hopeless, he continued to believe in the power of unity and understanding. This story has become a testament to the fact that even one spark of hope can light the fire of change, and everyone who was part of this journey has become a living example of how together we can overcome any obstacles. And what lessons do you think the general learned from his fight against racism? What moments in history particularly touched or inspired you? How do you see your role in combating bias and racism in your community? What steps do you think can help create a more just society? What stories about changes in your community can you share? We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Let us know in the comments what you think. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? How did you deal with such situations? You are very important to us, and we appreciate each of you. Your votes help us grow and develop. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Have a nice day and look forward to seeing your comments.